Hello and good afternoon. Apologies for the delay in starting here. We had to sort out some technical difficulties. Welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series. My name is Ahnaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We are pleased to be joined today by Roya Hakakian, who is an author and a journalist whose work appears regularly in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and other major publications, who joins us to discuss the topic, Iran arrives on campus. Roya Hakakian will speak for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. If you would like to ask a question, please feel free to use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the floor over to Ms. Roya Hakakian. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for hosting me today. I've been watching since October 7th the events on university campuses, and among one of the most impactful and concerning observations that I've had has been that how much some of the elements, some of the characteristics of what's occurring on university campuses are reminiscent for me of the 1979 revolution in Iran, to be specific, of the nature of the demonstrations and protests in Iran. And I'll get more specific to actually identify it more closely, because obviously these are entirely two separate settings and two separate populations, completely different eras. But there are shared qualities that make certain aspects of these two events similar. And I want to begin by saying what those are, in my view, and then go back to the history that I believe gave rise to those similarities and why I find that incredibly concerning. And I think that should be concerning to all of us. So I guess part of this similarity that I'm referring to is the mob nature of these protests. People who don't seem to know exactly the history, the details, the complexities of the subject matter, the complexities of the political issues that are involved, and so on, express very strong opinions about one side of this, namely, Hamas, and in their support for what Hamas committed against Israel on October 7th. There's a certain irrationality, and some of that we can see through videos that are emerging. In other words, we see people, videographers, going among the crowds and asking, when you say from the river to the sea, which river and which sea are you referring to? Or do you know what intifada means? And we've seen various interviewers confront the crowds with the details of what it is that they're saying or what it is that they're asking for. And there seems to be a lot that's missing from the base knowledge of these protesters. And so going back to 1979 Iran, there was a lot of misinformation that was circulating among the public. But that misinformation wasn't just wrong information. It was completely inflammatory material that had brought the crowds into the streets in the first place. For instance, there was a common belief that the Pahlavi regime had killed hundreds of thousands of political prisoners in Iranian prisons. That the degree to which the repression in Iran had taken place was could not be outdone by any other tyranny or dictatorship in any other place in the world. and that is sort of in some ways, a parallel to the degree to which Israel's so-called crimes are now being outsized by, calling them genocide, even when, international law does not agree with the terminology, or ethnic cleansing, and so on. That the shared quality between these two is that even when the facts aren't there is an outsized view, there is a completely, overwhelmingly exaggerated sense of the repression that have somehow been fed to these crowds, which seem incredibly committed to what they think is the truth. And so the question is, how does this happen? And why are these students, like, a very large majority of Iranians in 1979, are willing to take to the streets and express themselves in these certain ways, with no concerns about whether the details are in place, whether they actually know the history as well as they should to express such certainty about these very important issues or not. They're there anyway. So two very important forces have come together here. On one hand, and this is an observation that many people have made, there are Islamist groups on university campuses that have come together with non-Islamists, with radical leftist groups that have been existing and have been staging various uprisings over the past 10 years. And these two have somehow merged, whether it's been Black Lives Matter or other, fringe but radical groups on campuses and throughout the United States. They have somehow found each other. The independence, the desire for an independent Palestine on behalf of Palestinians or other Arabs in the United States have come together with these, other leftist organizations in the United States. Now, this goes to kind of offer the mirror image of this in the early 1960s in Iran. When Ayatollah Khomeini, the man who led the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and really was the chief figure who ultimately was responsible for unifying the Iranian nation against the Pahlavi regime and ultimately leading them to help overthrow the Shah. He, in the 1960s, was a very fringe Islamist voice too. He lived in Rome, he was in a seminary, and much of what he was talking about at the time did not appeal to a large swath of the population. He was chiefly talking about women's rights. He was against them. He did not like seeing women achieve equal rights. He didn't believe in egalitarian values that the Shah at the time was advocating. He didn't like women to be in the workplace. He certainly didn't want them to go without the hijab and appear in public. He called all of those things the corruption of family values and Islamic values, and the embrace of Western and American values, which he was absolutely against. But none of these things seem to resonate with the general public in Iran, which was at the time mostly middle class, and of course 50% women, many of whom were in the workplace, and many of whom had embraced the new, lifestyle and were enjoying it. They were getting educated, they were at universities, and there was no way that they could sympathize with the sermons of this cleric who wanted to basically, return them to, decades and centuries earlier and return women to the homes. So then the question was, how was it that somebody who did not appeal to the broader public could find such a large appeal? And that's the moment where the merging of the two sides of the Iranian protest movement or opposition movement occurred. In other words, there was Ayatollah Khomeini and the religious who were objecting to the Shah and to the monarchy because of its lack of embrace of Islamist values. And then there were communist and radical leftist groups who had their own complaints about the regime because they believed it to be a puppet of US imperialism. But they came together once the leftist groups somehow conveyed the message, not directly, obviously, but the sentiments that they had captured within the public, or at least within the secular, middle-class, educated public in Iran, was conveyed to the religious as an appealing and a shrewd approach in order to capture the imagination of a large swath of the public that was not on the side of the religious. So here, all of a sudden, we begin to see a shift in Khomeini's rhetoric. So he's beginning right around the early 1960s to speak less and less about women and about his objections to women's rights. It begins to slowly fade. And instead, what becomes really pronounced in his sermons is the notion that Iran or the Shah has become, or both of them have become, the dog of the American imperialists, or that Iran has lost its sense of sovereignty and independence because of its subjugation to the US imperialism and to the Americans. And he begins to give greatly inflammatory speeches to accentuate this notion that Iranians no longer had a sense of pride because Americans were present in Iran and they had certain rights that they were exercising that even Iranians didn't enjoy. And so once these two forces came together, once Khomeini began to augment his language with the messages that the left were giving, but also flavor it with his own Islamist ideology, was when he caught on fire, so to speak, when he became suddenly the broad national figure that everybody could agree on embracing. So I think part of what's happening on the university campuses is the ignorance, the lack of knowledge of the history within these campuses on the part of the students who don't have really the knowledge of what has happened in these previous instances throughout history when one group had legitimate concerns, legitimate demands, but felt that in order to execute or in order to achieve those demands, it needed to, or it was okay to join with other forces, and in this case, Islamist forces. And I think just as the Iranian Revolution, which had grand ambitions to create a democracy, achieve greater freedom for Iranians, at least on the part of the secular middle classes, failed and never, in fact, reached those goals, these university campuses are committing the same error and will fail at their project because they are joining their forces with these dangerous ideologies that they know very little about.
All right. Well, thank you for that presentation. It was very insightful. Our audience is kind of quiet today. We don't have any questions yet, so I will ask a few of my own if you don't mind.
Sure.
You kind of touched on this throughout your presentation, and you kind of ended on this note, but the element of the far left in these student demonstrations, can you speak to the similarities and differences between those left-wing elements in the protests of today versus the protests in the late 70s in Iran?
Well, the leftists have this in common, that both of them, both now and those in Iran, knew that they could not succeed alone, that it was clear for them that whatever ideology they had and however much they believed in it, that they by themselves were not enough to become widespread enough to succeed. And therefore, they knew that they needed to bring others to their side and were willing to join with forces that they did not know well, but thought that it was okay. Now, a very perfect example that's sort of relevant to some of the events that we've seen throughout the Middle East and Iran in the past couple of years is the women's movement, right? So in 1979, the Iranian left believed that it was okay, immediately after the Iranian Revolution, for women who were not believers in the mandatory Islamic dress code to wear the dress code just so it would benefit the revolution, just so, this revolution that was so brand new could take the next leap forward and become, get out of its newness and mature, right? So the idea was that even if these women don't believe in the idea of putting the hijab on, this is the sacrifice that they needed to make in order to bring about a national reconciliation, national solidarity, unity of various forces throughout the country. So everybody, even the left, became an accomplice in the project that Khomeini had, which was to drive women under the hijab, right? So this left, or these radical secular forces that we're seeing on university campuses, don't know that homosexuals are basically the most despised groups of people within the Palestinian territories and Gaza, and that they're subject to great imprisonment and executions and hangings. But when you tell them that that's the case, they still say it's okay. Even if that's the case, we will work with them. And so this sense of sacrificing somebody else's rights, whether it was women in Iran or it is gays, on behalf of this bigger cause, is the most dangerous feature that makes these two historical moments similar. Because once you begin to sacrifice the rights of these minorities, whether it was women in Iran or LGBTs here, you're allowing these brutal forces of Islamism to be empowered.
Now, so when you're talking about the embrace of far leftists who basically embrace Islamist ideologies to advance that certain revolutionary cause. We see a similar thing as you're mentioning here, where sometimes it's not exactly reciprocated, where you see some left-wing activists on some campuses. I've seen them do the Muslim call to prayer at these encampments, and then days later there's videos coming out where more Islamist-leaning members of these protests will kick out some of these queer and LGBT and far leftist activists. So what happened to these leftists in the 70s in late Iran once the Islamic Revolution had taken over?
Well, it took about a year and a great national drama for them to be practically wiped out. So the Iranian Revolution took place in the middle of February of 1979. And then the takeover of the American embassy in Tehran took place in November of 1979. And the drama that created, where the world's attention was focused on the 52 hostages that these Islamist students were keeping captive, allowed the regime to, behind the smokescreen that it had created, go on and exercise the most repressive and the most brutal roundup of all the opposition that it wanted to get rid of. And so suddenly, within a year, when Iran has obviously become a pariah nation because of the takeover of the American embassy, but also because of the overwhelming international focus on exclusively the fate of the hostages, there was a moment of darkness about everything else that was going on in Iran, about every other issue that was happening in the backdrop. And one of those things was the repression, the rounding up, the arresting, and the imprisoning and executing of all the opposition, whether it was secular, communist, or even other Islamic opposition to the regime. And I think, this could very well be the historical extension of what we are seeing on the university campuses and elsewhere, because they are unable to register what Hamas is actually saying, of what the leadership of Hamas is actually saying. And they are denying what they're hearing on behalf of Hamas. And that's when they become tools of a larger and far more dangerous project.
All right, thank you. Now, we have a few questions that are asking the same things, kind of phrased differently, but essentially, the problem is clear that the left and the Islamists are working together. How should the rest of us respond and defend against it?
I think there are several issues here at work, and I think we can begin by recognizing each one of them. One is that America has allowed, in fact, or enabled and empowered some of these Islamist groups over the past 56 years. The American strategy in Afghanistan, prior, obviously, to the rise of Taliban, when the Soviets were in Afghanistan, was to create a join with or enable the Islamist forces against the Soviet Union. So we have to recognize that some of the foreign policy of the United States, especially in dealing with communism and later on with some of the other sort of negative forces, have been the historical cause of this. But aside from that, there are certain aspects of history that we are completely disregarding, and the history of Iran and the history of the 45 years of this regime in Iran is one of the most insightful, informative pieces of history that could really profoundly inform and transform this debate, but somehow is failing to enter into this conversation, into this broader debate about October 7th and ongoing discussions about October 7th. So I think, you know, turning the public attention to the example of Iran and to the deep absence of the Iranian public's support for Hamas and for, you know, the ongoing war, you know, in Gaza, can be a very important lesson, but that is a piece that's not part of this broader conversation right now.
Now, moving away from the public and actually inside the kind of the inner workings and the closed doors of these universities, Andrea Spindle asks, given that the university administrators at the highest level as leftists, grads from faculties that have been indoctrinated for decades, how do we turn this around?
We have to figure it out. Honestly, I don't think, you know, either any one of us has a magic bullet. But what is clear is that this is part of a larger repressive movement that's taking place in the United States. That this isn't just about, obviously, Gaza, Israel, and the conflict there. It's also about so much else, you know, freedom of expression, you know, rights in the United States, what's happening vis-a-vis books and reading and, you know, libraries. I mean, we are seeing a crisis of democracy in America to the degree that we haven't seen. And I think what is really important now, it may not cure what we are seeing immediately, but what is very important and an essential first step is to see that this appears to be just about this conflict, but the conflict in and of itself is just the beginning of an attack on the American democracy and on Western democracy everywhere. And I think to make that connection, to see that, you know, supporting Hamas, allowing these voices that do not believe in, say, you know, the Jewish students on campuses to be Zionists, to wish to eradicate their opposition in the name of a higher cause, is just the beginning, the first step to a larger attack on democracy and democratic values here and elsewhere. One of the things that in the past few weeks has given me not simply, you know, intellectual concern, but truly fear, visceral sense of fear, is the scenes of people taking to the streets, blocking traffic to perform common prayer. One of the most important achievements of Western democracy has been to be able to separate religion and governance, religion and state. It has been to say you can practice whatever you want as long as you do it on your own, in your own homes or in your own places of worship. This is a great achievement. But the moment you see masses of protesters come and block a square, a big university campus, or or streets, public streets, to perform public prayer, that's when everybody should be hugely alarmed that the people who are doing this are actually undermining the greatest achievement, or one of the greatest achievements of our democracy, which is do it on your own, do it on your own dime, pray to whoever you want, as long as you do it at home, as long as you do it in your own house of worship. But it's become now that the notion that Khomeini or the Iranian Revolution somehow sold to millions of people in 1979 was do something bad for the end, which is a higher cause. And that's okay, because we all need to do something that we don't agree with because it helps the higher cause. And the higher cause right now is showing solidarity on behalf of Gaza or whatever. And that means, if that means to, all of you performing an Islamic prayer together in the middle of the street, that's okay.
All right. Well, thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more since we started just a little late. Contrary to the end goal of the demonstrations in the 70s in Iran, the potential in the US for these student demonstrations to ultimately overthrow our republic and install a bearded mullah into the White House is pretty unlikely. So, where do you see these demonstrations ultimately leading to in the United States and in the West?
Um, you know, um, First of all, I have to say that everybody in Iran, at least everybody who wasn't with the mullahs, thought that the idea of an Ayatollah running the affairs of the country was very, very unlikely, if not completely fantastic. I am certainly not of the belief that we're going to have a turbaned leader in America. But what I'm saying is that it is possible that in the process of pursuing whatever other greater cause, whether it's the Palestinian cause or the African American, vis-a-vis American police cause, once we begin to embrace dangerous ideas that tell us that the virtue of unity, the importance of unity for achieving that higher cause, gives us the license to come together with dangerous forces that ultimately undermine democracy. Giving into those can cut away, chisel away at the democracy that we have established. And that's, I think, what we have to be really careful of, that it won't be that the Ayatollahs will start running the United States, but it will be that we will create spaces for their influence peddling to take place further and further.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We have unfortunately run out of time for today's podcast. I want to thank you again for taking the time this week to join us, Roya.
All right. Thanks.
All right. Now, for our viewers and listeners, please join us this Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time for our Israel Insider podcast with Ashley Perry. We thank you again for joining us, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks.